just done. Well, we're recording now. So that's really the challenge. That's what I'm interested in. If a mediator is going to voice even questions about that draw on knowledge about what you might broadly call the normative framework. In other words, the rules that people are likely to be operating in if they go on to court. So I don't just mean the law, I also mean things like you will have to produce evidence. There'll be some delay. That might take the court a certain amount of time. So process information as well as legal information. Really, I'm interested in the how, because I think if it's not done well, that can rebound. I suppose that's true of many things in mediation. But I'll share some slides now, just a few thoughts that arose out of my PhD. Some of you may have seen some of these before, but I've narrowed it down to a specific focus. So let me see if I can do this. So there's our little starting point. And here's the challenge for us. So first of all, start with the good news. The good news was that I found in the great majority of the situations where I spoke to people, they can arrive at just results. And that's judging just as one way of judging it is within the range of what the courts would do. So if that's your measuring point, measuring your measure for justice, then most people fell easily within the range of what the courts might do. And I felt it became clear that a big reason for that was the simple fact that you're not going to sell a dud, that the other party's a player. They're not going to sign up to something that puts them at a massive disadvantage. So there's a constraint built into mediation most of the time that I want to come on to. There is a however. I still came to the conclusion that mediators are an essential backstop against injustice, that there were situations where mediator input did or didn't make the difference between an outcome that was within the range of what the courts would do or should do, and one that was not, that was, to me, quite a significant injustice in one particular instance. So those are the headline findings. There's a section where I spent some time analysing what people said about where they found out about legal information. Because that was part of when you're mediating within the justice system, I think it's pretty legitimate to have an eye to the context. And so whether or not the mediator had any role in this, so people did turn to others to find out about the legal framework. They had their own understanding. They sometimes got some information from the court. That's very patchy, very variable across our area. I think it's actually probably better in Edinburgh. Some turned to advice agencies or even to lawyers. I'm sorry to say, I didn't think that was terribly helpful. Unless they're in the room, most of the people I interviewed felt that the lawyer was telling them they had a very strong chance of winning. And that's perhaps there's some kind of bias. But I'm interested in where they said they got that from the mediator, or what they said about mediator input. So that's really what that's our subject matter today. So here's just some ideas, and this is the people who saw this positively. There's one comment. Yes, so these were people who said, yeah, I really liked it. The mediators were good. Here's one way in which they were good. Well, they gave me information. What kind of information? Well, in this case, the person said it was about the processes. He had found that helpful. There's what I think we might call reality testing. Somebody has clearly highlighted the potential for an expert report. Where they got 500 quid from, I don't know. That's probably right. Um, and there's somebody picking up on the onus of proof, which is quite helpful, I think, for a claimant to understand that if you can't actually, you're the one that has to show that your case is correct, and the respondent doesn't really have to do as much. However, we'll just go a wee bit further. So these are more things that were approved on. People quite like this. Sorry, my picture's in my way now. Are you willing to put forward any offers? So what you might call general encouragement to settle. Are you prepared to move? They didn't mind that. How low was I willing to go? So you get that sense of quite an activist mediator. Um, and even substantive input in some instances. There's one example where it looks as if the mediator has in front of, I got the impression it was in a joint session, the mediator's pointing out, well, if we do a totting up here, by by doing the repair, you've been saved money by the other person. So that sounds like a fairly substantive input by the mediator, as far as I can tell. Of course, I'm only getting their reports. However, here's another example which the person did not like. Uh, the mediator, she's called the woman, said to me, "What made you think you could withhold her salary?" So there's an interesting instance of mediator input being reported back. Of course, I've no idea who that was, but perhaps that's part of what triggered this. There were others who were less positive. Um, for some, the mediators were simply invisible. There's a little dialogue between me and this participants. I fished, I suppose. Did they provide anything? Because I think the person had emerged from the mediation still fairly puzzled about what might happen next. Another guessed that it was because they weren't allowed to. I'll come on to that in a second. Another reached the conclusion that they simply didn't know, and that might be true, actually. I think that's a factor who was talking. And another person was just critical of what he saw as being message bearers, going back and forth, etc. And I've put at the bottom, I do wonder if the facilitative tradition has led to some of that constraint. And for some of us, there's a significant anxiety about the idea that we might be the source of any information that doesn't come from the parties. And I certainly want to acknowledge there are some traditions within which it would be taboo for mediators to introduce any information that doesn't come from the parties. So I'm not knocking that. I think in the context that we're looking at, maybe I question the applicability of that approach. But these are things that parties said. So, why does it matter? Well, I suppose, this is another person who didn't get a settlement and then went to get legal advice. And I was speaking to him after he'd had his advice from a lawyer. And I just thought it was quite interesting because I think in his final sentence, he captured, I think, something that we probably all have encountered. The idea that the sheriff will understand that all I need is to get in front of the sheriff. I'll tell my story. They'll get it. They'll punish the bad person. They'll vindicate me, and I'll get my money. I'm caricaturing, but in a way that this person sort of reflected that. And he found his conversation with the lawyer fairly sobering, because in fact, it turned out I went to the proof in this particular hearing, evidential hearing. It turned out he couldn't demonstrate he had a contract. But the sting in the tail for the other party was that it turned out the sheriff said to the other party, that doesn't mean you pay nothing. And I'm going to award an amount based on kind of time in line, if you like. What's the work that he's actually done? And he ended up getting what he would have taken in the mediation. So that's kind of an interesting appendix to one case. So I think it matters because I think parties without any of that input can sometimes have a a naive understanding of what they're going to get. And then this is one of my conclusions, drawing on Ellen Waldman and Lola Ojalabi's work. I don't know if you want me to read that, but the point is that I don't think mediation has to be a source of injustice, and party decision making most of the time protects people. But because it's party decision making, it has to be a possibility that people will choose to do things that are miles away from what the courts would do. And that could be seen as an injustice for the one who doesn't know. And it was Ellen and Lola came up with this idea of a settlement that shocks the conscience. So there's an article by them, it's worth reading. Their idea is that most of the time mediators don't intervene substantively, but if they hear something that is egregious, an egregious injustice, then they ought to have an input. So at the end of all that, I'll stop. You'll be relieved to hear. That's just an introduction. I think there's a huge amount of practical wisdom locked up inside the minds on this call. And that's really been my aim. I want to try and get us into groups. I'm hoping that the groups will be reasonably random. I think we'll just start with random, won't we, Pauline? I'll maybe stop sharing now. So what I'm going to challenge us to do is in groups, perhaps the more experienced people can start. Hang on, I need to find my controls to stop sharing. There we are. I think the more experienced people might want to start, but really I'm interested in the question of how. How do you go about? Let's just take it for read that you're in a situation where you believe it's a wise move to be introducing some kind of information about what's likely to happen next or what the person's likely to encounter if they don't reach a resolution. It's an everyday scenario, isn't it, for small claims mediation, that you will from time to time be up against it. I'm interested in the how. And let's have a conversation. I've got some thoughts about it of my own, but there are many of you much more experienced mediators now in the small claims context. So let's have a conversation. How long have we got, Pauline? About 15 minutes? Is that too long?
Yeah, we can do 15 minutes. That's fine. I'll put my timer on for that. And I'll put everyone into groups just now.
I wonder, no, I'll tell you what, let's just say 10. It keeps the groups
10.
quite short. It might be slightly too short, but it gives a bit of time to debate at the end. So let's say a 10-minute conversation, just gather some ideas. I mean, they can literally be phrases. Phrases are good, or approaches, and just how we go about it. So will you do groups for us,
Yeah,
Pauline?
I can do that. And if each group could appoint a spokesperson, I think, to come back to you, Charlie, is that okay?
Yeah. Lovely. And we need to stop recording or pause. Challenge each group to do is to try to compile in written form, just while maybe one group's talking, a brief note, if you can, of specific phrases. And after the session's over, if you could send those in, we'll share that, because it can be useful to have a glimpse of how other people put things. I mean, you know, we steal ideas all the time, and quite rightly too. So just we'll have to be pretty brief, but could we turn to group one and just get a couple of thoughts? Pauline, can you remember who was in group one, or tell us? Maybe group one can remember.
I apologise, I don't remember, and the breakout rooms have
Oh, I've still got them.
closed.
That would be Ben, Cordelia, Daniel, Lorna, or Sharon.
That's me then. I'm feeding back from Lorna. Yeah, so we talked about, so particularly given lack of legal knowledge and trying to be facilitative about avoiding using statements that were too directive and focusing instead on questions. So questions like asking, well, what evidence do you have that you would present in court? And using perhaps lay language where we could. So you might not say what evidence you have, you might say, do you have receipts for that? We've talked about sort of asking people to think through, well, what do you think really would happen? What do you think a judge would say to that? What do you think would happen when it went into the case, rather than us giving our opinion? Because sometimes it just helps people to then think through, actually, no, I would need to bring a case, I would need to bring evidence to this. A couple of phrases that people had used, like, well, these are the kinds of things that I've seen. So it's not making a judgment about what would happen, but a statement on the kind of experiences that they'd seen. And that might be about process as well as about decisions. And then thinking through, well, even if we talked a lot about people who are convinced that they would win, and therefore on the surface quite happy for it to go back to court because they think they've got such a strong case. So asking them to think about, well, even if you do have a strong case, even if you would win, what do you understand about the process and the time that it would take to go through that, and the impact of all of that? So again, just getting people to think to think differently. So yeah, that's probably, I'll have missed a few things, but it was the questioning approach, really.
Yes, it'd be fair to call those, what would you call them? I think you would call them focused open questions. You know, it's an open question, but it's what do you understand about? And you're sort of illustrating, probably, in asking the question, I have an understanding about. I think that's kind of implicit in that question, isn't it? In everyday speech, what do you understand about the court process? You're unlikely to say that if you've no understanding yourself. So I think that's quite interesting device. And yeah, okay, thanks very much for that. I'm sure that, I think what I'll do, we'll go to group 6, because I imagine they're sitting thinking, oh, we'll be last. So let's have group 6 next, and then we'll kind of jump around. So that would be Chris, Helen, Oyinkro, Pinky, and Roy. One of you like
I'm the deputed speaker.
Roy.
Yeah, I think we focus more on what than how. I think we came up with 3 things that I think are relatively uncontroversial. One, we were inclined to speak about time, the amount of time that's just wasted should you need to go to court. And then Chris picked up something that said, and of course there's the delay. This could be anything up to 6 months. These seem to be fairly objective things that we can say, and we can say to them both. There was a loss of control, that if you want to let it go to the sheriff, you're relinquishing control. You're just giving it up to somebody else to do, in contrast to the mediation, and a sense of you're missing the opportunity for closure, which is going to be important for you. I think more controversial and arguable would be what I call disabusing the parties. And that's disabusing them of 2 things. One, that they will get their chance to tell their story, because they will have a very limited time and they will just be held to prove things and do that. So say disabusing them of their dreams of what might happen in court. And that sense of they will be put to proof if they're the plaintiff, and will need to adduce that rather than expect that the sheriff is going to put their case in order and then hear it.
But did you at all talk about the conundrum of how to disabuse people of their dreams while still having them think that you are well-intentioned towards them?
We didn't get that far, I'm afraid, Charlie.
Okay, because that's the knack, isn't it? I mean, you're doing it for their sake, aren't you? You know, it's not just to be perverse or difficult.
We didn't get there. What might be interesting is, obviously, if you get asked about it by an individual, you have to respond. But maybe some of these things are best done in joint session, when you could say to the parties, okay, we seem to be struggling here a bit in terms of finding a solution. Wouldn't it be helpful for you if we just outline what could happen if it doesn't get settled here and goes to court? And if you do that with them together, you've got a sense, I think, of impartiality that you might feel more reluctant if you were doing it one-on-one.
Thank you. We'll come back to together. Let's take another group. I'm having a look at group 5, which was Alison, Alan, I think it was Sandy, Mary, and Emma.
Hi, Charlie. Yeah, so we initially started talking about setting the scene for the mediation, and pre-meetings kind of were mentioned, just to share the process and the court, some information about the court. So we had some discussion about that can be quite a kind of powerful conversation to have, so that there's you know, an expectation or an understanding. And I think it was mentioned that especially in Edinburgh, there's maybe 30 to 40% of cases come straight to mediation. They haven't actually, the parties haven't encountered anything to do with the court. So so that was one of the things we talked about. Then we started to get into what kind of things would you say if you were in the mediation itself, in the joint session or in private. So some of the kind of phrases that we kind of discussed were things like, well, one of the things is, I'm not here to give you legal advice, but have you considered the consequences of, or have you considered scenarios? Asking them, how do they feel about certain things, or how would they feel if? So asking them to think about, you know, the potential outcome. Another one is that if you're struggling, if you're the mediator and you're struggling to understand, to ask them to help you understand, because if you're there to try and help them and you're struggling to understand where they're coming from, then, and that probably would be more in a private session, I guess. So I guess it's not wanting to put them on the spot, but just challenging them a bit to say, you know, have you considered, how do you feel?
You're implying, you know, where you get to, I don't grasp.
Yeah.
In brackets, because it's mental or it's wrong. Help me understand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to move on quickly. Group, let's go to 2. So you can see where this is going. That is Alistair, Bronwyn, Carol, Jane, Kat, and Louise. Couple of phrases, please. Or we're just going to run out of time.
I'm happy. Well, we concentrate on something slightly different, on the problems that mediators without experience of court had, as opposed to those who have got experience.
Okay.
And we discussed how it was that many parties are very concerned, sometimes as even I use the word frightened of the process, and wanted to be reassured and would benefit from knowing more about how it actually, what's actually going to happen. And we discussed how people such as myself and others who had legal experience could reassure them in this kind of way. And it wasn't so easy. One or two others said, who weren't practical lawyers, to do this. And it was wondered whether there should be some process whereby less experienced mediators in court process should perhaps be encouraged, for some system just to go and sit in the back of the court and we'll see how it happens. Since the days of Zoom, of course, there's less. In the days gone by, you used to sit in the back of the court and spend a number of days nothing happening, but at least you saw what was happening.
That's
generally. So
I'm going to pause you.
In essence, voting on, yeah.
I'm sadly, I think I'm going to have to draw a veil over the others because I don't want to overrun. I'm conscious of 2 groups we didn't get to. If you could share what you were discussing in written form at all, if somebody could just make a very brief note, bullet points would be fine, particularly catchphrases. I want to share my screen one final time before we stop, because I did jot down, I think. Yes, I mean, here's one I prepared earlier. I don't know if I think it's not too far away, is it, from some of the things that you were saying? You know, can I just walk you through what happens next? I think I heard that. Are you familiar with the rules on expenses? There's an interesting one. And again, that's probably not impossible for a person who's not got a legal background to get on top of. They're not that complex, although they need to be looked at. don't take my word for it. That's a favorite one of mine. You know, whatever I share, if you feel you need to consult someone else, maybe we have to pause, maybe you have to take advice. And also sometimes just a simple pause, that bottom one. So I've shared, or I've asked you some questions. Do you want some time? And I think there were some examples that came from within the group of somebody thinking again simply by being asked. So that I'll throw that out there. These are some of the ideas that I have. But I get the sense that this is going on, that we're wrestling with this day in, day out, and whether we like it or not, it's a skill that many of us have developed and are developing. People without a legal background, I would still strongly argue there's no reason at all why many of the same techniques shouldn't be applied, because one can gather some data and one can certainly ask questions, and quite informed questions. And sometimes people, like Alison's example, it was actually the women's maths. There was as much as anything that she maybe needed to rethink. So a lot of common sense can also come into it. So thanks very much for cooperating. I hope that's been useful. Please do send in any ideas. We'll share them. And it still says 11:15. So at that, I will draw a halt. Sorry for the groups that didn't get feedback.